Revolution, and they should also be predicting that there's some tension between the American colonists and the British. I think most of us have an idea of what happened at the Battle of Lexington, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background information now so that we are really prepared for our document analysis today. Questions before we begin? Great, so I'm going to put on my teacher hat now. All of you are both as students and as teachers. Your students acting as if you are in this class, and your teachers thinking through the moves that I'm doing in order to be sourcing. So, writing in the words that are in bold and that are underlined, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened at the Battle of Lexington. So, the British forces heard a rumor that the Americans had a bunch of ammunition that was located in the city of Concord. What city?
Concord.
So at Concord, they had to go through Lexington in order to get there, and they really wanted to go and get this ammunition because they were worried about the colonists having some sort of future attack. So they wanted to cut off the American colonists from their supplies before things got any worse. So they leave out of Boston, they followed the black line to Lexington, and the event that we're talking about today was at the Lexington Green. Americans heard that the British were coming, so the Massachusetts militia, what's that word?
Militia.
They came out to fight. They're really upset that the British are coming and are about to take their ammunition. So this was called the Battle of Lexington. What was it called?
The Battle of Lexington.
As we are going through this battle today, we are going to see that there's a historical debate about who actually fired the first shot at the Battle of Lexington. Historians still to this day disagree about who fired the first shot. And that's because there are two different sides to this story, and both sides are telling different versions about what happened. Important note is that the Americans won. This is a big deal because it's really the first time that the colonists proved to the rest of the world that they can actually win. They are showing the world that they have the potential to be beating the British. And at this point, the British were a global superpower. This battle is also important because it's the first battle of the American Revolution. It starts the whole thing off. And so sometimes it's referred to as the shot heard around the world. So obviously this is a really important battle. It's a key moment in American history, and so we need to try to investigate to figure out what happened at this battle. Who fired the first shot, and what happened on that day. And of course, we're going to do this by looking at a series of documents. Go ahead and answer the check for understanding questions at the bottom of your page. Take 2 minutes, silently answer those questions. Great work, Shelby. More seconds. Here, who was one of the sides fighting at the at the Battle of Lexington?
American.
Who was the other side, class? British. So we have the American colonists versus the British. Now looking for hands, why was the American win such a big deal? Thank you, Emily.
The British are a global superpower and the Americans weren't expected to win.
Great. Last question. Why is there a historical debate about who fired the first shot? Yes.
Thank you. It's because there are two sides reporting the event.
Good, yep, and both sides are telling different stories about what happened. So we have now gone over our key information that we need to know before we start our investigation of our sources. So go ahead and turn to the next page. We are now going to look at two different images to see if we can answer this question of who fired the first shot at the Battle of Lexington. So I'm going to put the first image on the board. Once I do that, if you could write down everything that you see in that first image, you're going to take 1 minute and silently write down everything you see in the first image. Try to write down as much as possible, including details about color. With your table group, start discussing everything that you see in the first image and then transition into the second question of what evidence does this provide about what happened at the Battle of Lexington.
I don't know if they'll be able to differentiate, like, do they know that one, like, would they know at this point?
Or like enough to just bring it in.
Is it better with the lights on?
They don't even I love you
So let's go back to the question of what do you see then? So if they look organized, but there's a lot in there, like there's a lot to see. Let me know when you've been waiting. One more minute.
Or you can do like
They fire as a volley, firing,
Back together in 3, in 2, and in 1. Looking for hands. Starting first with some things that you see. Not some inferences, just some things that you see. Just what do you see? Andrew.
I see both sides firing. I see smoke coming from both guns on both sides.
Great. Miss Worth?
I see people wearing red coats, looking very organized in the background, and one of them's riding a horse.
What about them makes them look organized?
They're in lines, and they aren't dying.
Okay.
Julie?
What she's saying, those are in like very clean, consistent uniforms as opposed to a rabble of ill-suited militiamen.
Okay. Add on. Yep.
A lot of the militiamen have their fists raised at the British.
Okay. Great detail. Other things that you see.
Look like one end is dead.
Two. Okay.
I can see one. Oh,
Where-
I see the two.
Where does it look like this is happening? What is this setting, in other words? Yeah.
I think it's a green. It might be Lexington.
Okay, that's an inference. What do you see that's happening in this setting?
Background.
Tell me more, Ashley. What do you see that's happening?
That it's a confrontation between two sides.
That was my bad. What do you see about this setting? How do you know it's a green?
Because it is green on the rocks, and then you see some buildings on the Veronica.
Okay, good. I know we're all kind of starting to laugh about this. I think with kids, though, they first need to recognize what they see before they start drawing conclusions. And so, as teachers, we need to first identify what are the things that we're looking for them to be seeing before we move on. So now that we've identified things that we see, what evidence does this provide about what happened at the Battle of Lexington? What do you think happened based on what you see in this picture? Ms. Worth?
I think that because the British, or well, the people wearing red, there doesn't seem to be any of them that are injured, and they seem to, again, still be very structured, that they did not shoot, that the people who are, wait, the people in red don't have any people that have been injured, so they haven't shot, they were the ones who shot, because there are people on the other side that are injured.
Okay, good. That's one possible explanation. Add
Can I counter what you said?
on, please.
I think that the colonists are actually raising their hands because they're reloading their muskets. They're on their second or third shot. They've already fired. I mean, the smoke is like clearly gone towards the British soldiers. There's no indication the British soldiers have fired at all. So I think the colonists fired the first shot.
Other ideas? Tom?
I disagree with that because when I look at the British officer and the way he's got his little spear pointed towards the colonists, it looks as though he's already directed his army to have fired at the colonists, and it looks like the smoke is mostly on their side.
Great.
From the cannon.
Mr. Costi.
I would like to argue in favor of Mr. Manuel because it seems like after the British had received fire coming from the colonists, it's possible that the British general then signaled his troops to fire in return.
Julie?
I would like kind of both this man. The only injuries that we can see are on the colonist side. And so I think the only conclusion I can draw is that the British have fire. Now I can't say who fired first. It's hard to tell if any British are injured, but the only clear injuries are on the colonist side. God lives British.
Better articulate.
Okay. Raymond?
I'd like to build that because there's so much smoke on the British side, preventing us from being able to see if there is injuries over there, really does push that the British fired first.
Okay, I'm here.
Thank you. I was even also thinking about the view of the picture, how up close you see more of the colonists, and in the background you kind of see the British. I think that whoever drew this picture wants you to know that they were injured colonists, and just kind of in the background the British were there, the cause of that.
Okay. After looking at this picture, raise your hand if you think that the British fired the first shot. Raise your hand if you think that the Americans fired the first shot. Raise your hand if you don't know. So, after looking at this picture, we really aren't any closer to the truth of who fired the first shot. So as good historians, we are not just going to look at one source, we're going to look at yet another source. And so we have one more image, we're going to do the same process. You're going to first write down silently everything that you see, and then I'll give you a second to talk with your table groups about what you see and if you can figure out who fired the first shot. Here's the second image. Silently write down everything that you see. That one, yeah. Take 30 more seconds to silently write down everything that you see. Go ahead and transition with your table group. Start discussing what you see first, and then what evidence that this provides about what happened at the Battle of Lexington and who fired the first shot. Okay, back together in 3, in 2, and in 1. Starting with things that you see. So only things that you see directly from the picture. In the same participation, I want to hear from different people. You all have eyes, you all can tell me something that you see. Start with you, I'm Nicole Call, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I see a lot of red coats.
Great, another thing you see.
The British are strong in numbers and force.
Okay, so there's more British.
Oh, yes.
Great, yeah.
The Americans are one and Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I see fallen and fleeing a minute.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, back table.
Did you say the buildings part yet? Sorry, the buildings are roughly the same, and even though the grass is noticeably browner, it is very much the same like setting.
Good. Yeah, that's getting into a comparison between the two images. So the buildings do vaguely look the same, and even the grass, it's still there, even though the coloring is a little bit different. Julie?
The smoke also still looks like it's mostly on the British side, and the injury is still mostly on the American side.
Good.
And I think the thing we were saying about the organization of them is consistent from the first image.
Because they're in lines?
Yes.
Good. Yep.
And they're being led by a, person on horseback.
Great. Can you make your point about the horseback?
That horse is like literally 2 stories tall.
Oh, yeah, it's big.
No way that horse is that big.
I hadn't noticed that before, but it really is true. Like the horse in this looks massive, especially if you compare it to the buildings. Miss Worth?
That's why I would also maybe throw out that perhaps the horse has just been galloping, and since this dirt looks pretty dead, could be dust from the horse.
There you go.
And not the horse.
Okay, so we're transitioning into what evidence does this provide us about what happened at the Battle of Lexington, and more specifically, who fired the first shot. Anyone want to make an argument they know who fired the first shot based on this painting? Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to argue that the English fired the first shot, and that this is an American depiction, because if this were a British publication and an etching, they wouldn't publicize themselves firing on people running away. It would be viewed as dishonorable.
Interesting. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'd like to make a counter argument and say that while it looks like the colonists are retreating, they're in fact regrouping to surround the British troops who are cornered in one space.
Okay, Sam?
But I don't think you can necessarily make that argument, since there are still significantly more British in the back of this around.
Yeah.
Yeah, but also if you're making this British publication and to show your people, at the same time you'd also want to say like, hey, we need to make sure that we have order. We want to make sure that we're still rolling over America. They need us because look how disorganized they are. They don't have any way to roll over themselves. We need to bring this to them. So if this would be their publication, they need us for this purpose. We've got greater numbers. We have more organization. Look what we can bring to them to help them.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would say that I would say that this is from an American perspective. I would definitely grossly exaggerate the story by saying, look how few of us there were, and all of these British people came up and they fired on all of these innocent, unarmed people.
Good. So we're transitioning a little bit. We're saying that, you know, we have some evidence of who fired the first shot, maybe, that goes kind of both ways, but we're not really any closer to the truth of who fired the first shot. And I'm starting to hear some questions raised. So let's move on to the next question. What other information would you want to know about these images to better understand the Battle of Lexington? Take about 2 minutes, talk with your group. What other information about the images specifically?
Yes. What's over there?
Was it me?
Okay, back together in 3, in 2, and in 1. Again, looking for hands. What were some things that you noted or that you would like to know about these 2 images? Yeah.
We said that we wanted to know when and where it was produced and who painted it.
Great answer. Other ideas? Julie?
I think this also says, what publications produced them, or what they were for.
Okay, other ideas?
Thank you. We said we wanted the W5 of the to have all the information.
Great. 2, you all are raising some interesting questions. You're almost predicting the exact information I'm about to tell you. So if you go ahead and track the board, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about both of these sources. So the first one is by a man named Henry Sandham, and it's from the year 1886. This was commissioned by the Lexington Historical Society, and he is actually Canadian. Now, it's 1886. The Lexington Historical Society is about to create a museum, and so they want Henry's work to be prominently displayed in their museum in Lexington. Little bit of context about Lexington. Lexington High School, their mascot is the Minutemen. On the third Monday in April every year is Patriots Day. They run a marathon on that day. Everyone has off from work. There's a big football game, and there's even a reenactment first thing in the morning. And so, needless to say, Lexington takes their history very seriously, and so that's why they commissioned this work. The other one is by a man named Amos Doolittle, and it's from the year 1775. Doolittle was a soldier who was in Connecticut, and he was called up to Massachusetts after the Battle of Lexington because they thought that the British were going to attack again on Lexington. But the British ended up retreating back to Boston, and so he actually was up there and was kind of bored, and so he used his time to interview people who were at the Battle of Lexington about what happened, and then he created this engraving. This engraving is actually the most popular image of the Battle of Lexington. So thinking about this last question, does the information that you just received change the way that you think about the documents? Take about 3 minutes and discuss with your table groups. Does it change the way you think about these documents, and if so, how? What do y'all think? Does this change the way you think? So how does it change the way you think about them? Why do you say that?
Don't call me, don't not allowed to call me. For future reference.
Coming back together. Just a quick share out, probably one person from each table. What y'all discuss based on each table? Pick one person from your table. Explain what you shared. Shelby.
I think there's a question about the second one, like there's still some questions we don't have answered, like who was Doolittle was interviewing, if it was both sides, and I think this one would get a more accurate depiction of what happened and be more trustworthy. But there's still some questions that we have that maybe the first one was answered, but the second one we're still a little bit wary of, so yes.
Okay, we'll leave table. Pick someone. What do you guys discuss?
So I think we talked a little bit about the purpose and the audience of the first one. We had some questions that were like, what could some possible biases be? And then thinking about like who the intended audience was.
Okay, good. Let's table.
Can I actually jump in with that? So you're saying that with the, you were saying you had that question for the first one or the second one?
The first one in particular.
I feel like that question is even more pressing with the second one. Was he just doodling or did he have a reason to be engraving this? So why is he
The second one?
Yes.
Do you think that the first one is politically motivated?
Not just because it's Canadian, I think it's just told from a perspective where when you're looking at things maybe 100 years later, you tend to embellish. So even though it's still the same picture, it definitely made the colonies seem a lot braver.
Okay.
It is.
Yeah.
But then I will also think that like the first one would be politically motivated because it's 1886, so you have all this time for people to have different opinions and to like force their opinion on something because it's like 100 odd years later.
Yeah. Emily?
I think also, economically motivated for the first one, if you are someone that's being called to paint something for the museum, especially in like post-Reconstruction America, that's gonna be a big old deal. Or it, like what it means to be an American is something pretty different from what it means to be an American in 1775.
Great. And KCC at BCW. Oh, we already got you guys. So after looking at these two images, we now see the importance of sourcing. Having this source information helps us to better understand the purpose of these documents and what they both are trying to show us. We still are not very close though to figuring out who fired the first shot and what happened on the Lexington Green that day. So we're gonna try looking at some written sources. So go ahead and turn to the next page of your packet. You now have document A from a guy named Barker. You are going to read this document, and as you're reading, you're going to start answering the questions at the bottom. Feel free to discuss them with your table, but really focus on the source information and who this is coming from. Any questions before you begin? Okay, go ahead and get started. A lot of us have started writing. Feel free to be talking to your tables.
For the sake of time, because we're adults, you don't have to feel pressure to have every question answered on your paper as long as you talk about them.
Attention youngsters, it's begun to rain, and as a maroon CRV with license plate 888AYO, your sunroof and your windows are down.
That's the damage that happened. By the way, it's got KCC and stuff on it.
Oh my goodness.
If you have any hand, you want to share one for me? And then they started, she's at John Eric, which is 10th grade English, she's doing teaching there's a lot of behavioral issues, yeah, there's like, they have them, so I need to definitively say every time. Yeah, no, and also, nobody's arguing. And so we're just putting out that's right.
Why do you think he wrote that? Diary. Do you think it was like something he was just writing to himself at the end of the battle, or do you think he had a different purpose?
So I would just strengthen that. It's a military operations. Myself. I may make an inference that the military law is keeping for the superiors.
Without orders,
With that intention, like that intention diary.
One more minute.
we did it wrong.
Why is he bothering to write the lie
I was a joke. It was just a joke. It was just a joke.
Okay, bringing it back together. Bringing it back together. So, what evidence does Lieutenant John Barker provide us to help us with this question of what happened and who fired the first shot? Yep, so like what is John Barker telling us about what happened there and who fired the first shot? Kofsky?
In the middle of the paragraph, he is talking about how they were prepared for an attack, and then right in the middle it says, as we came near them, they fired 1 or 2 shots, thus claiming that the American colonists were first to fire.
Yeah, so they were prepared for an attack. Did they want to shoot them?
Seemingly no.
Okay.
And on Ms. Worth?
I would say definitively no, because Mr. Barker states without intending to attack them. So saying that the intent of the British soldiers was to pass through, not to kill anyone.
Good. Other things we learned from this document. Yeah.
The British, upon reaching this area, had already been marching through the night, they'd gone through water, so they were fatigued, they were not thinking correctly, possibly, and this contributed possibly to the chaos of the British numbers when they were attempting to not fire on people.
Okay, interesting. That's new information to us. We didn't get that from the images, so that's the first time that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the first time we're really seeing that. Other ideas? Here.
I would actually be questioning why they're coming through the heat like that at 2 o'clock in the morning. And you don't want drama.
Great.
But they didn't have any intentions of doing anything. Right?
Great. Yep, add on. Yeah, go ahead.
So can we infer, Chris, when you're saying,
Yep.
the diary is a military diary, he's keeping these records for his superiors, or is this a personal diary?
What do you think?
I mean, I'm assuming that he would be writing this for his superiors, to keep a track of what's happening, not keeping this for his own amusement.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I specifically agree with that because of it's very specific in terms of times. Like at 2 o'clock we did this, at 5 o'clock we did this, 5 miles away. It's like very specific, whereas if it was a personal diary, it might be much more like summative rather than detail oriented.
Great evidence. What about the date?
I'm actually jumping about the diary. The diary comment is, or that question is a huge misconception with our kids. They see diary and they automatically assume, oh, he was just writing to himself. This was a Dear Diary moment. When, in general, officers of the past, if they're writing a diary, it's not for themselves, it's for their superiors. And that's something that we'll need to explicitly teach to our kids so that they can understand that.
Or you could just put in the source note, right? If you know that's a misconception for your students, I would just add it into the source note, like commonly diaries kept by military officers were for.
Yeah. One way I've had the conversation is this diary public or private, and why do you think that? Because kids can understand, like, oh, private diary, it's just going to be for that person. But if you use evidence like what Ms. Worth does, you can actually show that this is meant to be a public audience. Go ahead and continue.
With regard to the date, at this point in American history, or at this point in history, rather, you should have some pretty serious context about Massachusetts in particular. And so the intolerable acts are wrapping up and people are pretty pissed. And Massachusetts, in the view of the British, are like just traitor bastion, and like the British are actively trying to keep down an active rebellion.
Good.
And so, yeah.
Great. Other things we learned from this text. Kira.
That some things don't add up, like they weren't prepared, but, well, he tried to make it seem like they weren't prepared, like they had just heard about it on their way there, but then it said they were prepared for the attack, so it was just, it was contradictory.
Okay. Last one, Julie.
Yeah, he also talks about the disorganization of the British, which is very different from what we saw in our first two documents. And it's also interesting for like why he might be mentioning that, if this is a public diary or for his superiors. Maybe that's a means of self-defense, like why we killed those Americans, or maybe it's really what's going on, but like this idea they fired without any orders, and that even the British soldiers we formed on the common with difficulty, and the men were so wild that they could hear no orders. So like the British themselves, it sounds like we're kind of a hot mess too at this point. And what was his purpose in saying that? Just something that was.
Great. Yeah. I also think it's important to recognize the audience at the time besides the superiors. Like, this is British people, like the British soldiers are firing technically on their own citizens. Like, the American colonists are not quite their own independent country, and so they do have to be like covering themselves, like, oh, yeah, we did fire on these other people that are technically our citizens. So the audience too, and like what their motivation might be, is really interesting. So when you have this discussion with kids, you also want to ground it in this like strengths and weaknesses of the perspective. You know, some strengths would be it's from that time period. He is is from the British side, but those are also some things that might be a weakness, and having that discussion with kids. For the sake of time, I want us to move on to the last document, which is document B. This one is going to be from a colonist point of view. Again, you're going to go through the same process of reading it, annotating it, and then answering the questions at the bottom. I already see that Ms. Worth is starting at the source line at the bottom before she goes to the text. It's a great way to teach sourcing. Yeah, feel free to start talking once you've read it.
No, 2 o'clock is on the Sunday, 5 o'clock is based on the hour. Oh, right, okay. Square the numbers? Okay. Right, both 3 on the top, both 3 on the top.
Same thing.
Oh, yeah, no, you're right, so first account.
But also it's like 3 more credible periods while our bachelor's. They're like opposed to the 1 more thing. But it is, it's like everything rather
That's my thing, like, I feel like if I rob the bank and I'm like writing it down quickly, like, this is what happened, I feel like I'm trying to like come up with my story before, yeah, so like we can sit down, and then everybody else just seems like I'm just like, tell them, because like now they're.
No, there was no reason, sad thing,
Guys, like what you said earlier, so we don't get to that. Yeah, especially because
What am I doing? Why are they so is that employment, what they might say?
This is like actually conversation.
I think maybe like in a manner perspective.
I do want you to for the just in case you don't even care for like so it is saying that
But I mean, the kids are actually.
All 30
I guess
goes down together. Read the language of it.
because it was actually conjured up or written. Trustworthy. You understand what I'm saying, right?
You're already outside with your gun.
Yeah, unless you
Unless you like, there's no reason for you to put them outside between your neighborhood.
Nathaniel and Philip.
So the main
Yeah, McGraw.
That would be after the day.
You would still be hearing by the first hand.
They're saying they were just chilling out there with their guns for no reason.
There are two of them that are all trying to say the same thing.
I mean, the British are coming to take your ammunition. British are coming to take the ammunition, that's why they're there too. They're trying to do it under the darkness.
I know a little bit about it, but I still don't live
The idea is to give like a chance to really like no, I mean, I was just like, yeah, you would, no. And I think like especially speaking everything we start modeling
I guess you're more like Salem area.
Okay, reading it back together. Thoughts on this document, just in general. Key takeaways, what are all of these guys trying to say? Ms. Ward, thank you for your participation today.
You're welcome. Thank you, Ms. House, I appreciate that, I tried to check. So a key takeaway here, well, actually, a key wondering is why are all these Americans up at 5 o'clock in the morning, waiting for trouble, to echo point previously. But then his narrative is that their backs were turned, they were ambushed, it's a mess. All British's fault.
Okay, Tom?
You forgot a key element of the backstory, which is that one Mr. Paul Revere had driven all the way from Boston to alert them of the British.
The prison coming, the prison coming.
Yeah.
But going back to the text, yeah, it does say that they proceed for the green.
The prison coming.
No, it's actually from Boston.
If
you go back,
I keep telling you, the prison's coming, the prison coming.
He's captured in between, like.
yeah.
I told you, the prison coming, the prison coming. Booyah.
Other ideas from this source. What were some key takeaways from all these guys? Yeah.
Thank you. That 34 people can all unanimously agree on the incidents that happened.
Okay. So I'm gonna move our conversation. I think each table group had some really good takeaways about this. I want to hear just a couple. But moving this conversation into the language of strengths and weaknesses, especially comparing it to document A, what were some of the strengths of this document? Yeah, right here.
It was a sworn testimony
Okay, so why is that a strength in your mind?
because, you're supposed to tell the truth under oath.
Yeah, keyword supposed to.
Yeah.
Julie brought up the point that it's a sworn testimony, more than likely under a British court-martial.
Good, so they're telling it to the British side, great point.
There's 34 people, opposed to the one person who's saying.
Good, so yeah, strength in numbers, exactly. So what are some weaknesses of this one compared to the other ones? Yeah.
So these are technically at the time British subjects who are potentially standing trial for shooting at British soldiers. So I could see why 34 people would agree on self-preservation and not having to go to jail for firing on their soldiers.
Good, yeah. Emily?
It's 6 days post as opposed to the day after.
Okay. Other thoughts? This word?
To connect that point, Mr. Kofsky was talking about how within those 6 days, that gives everybody an ample amount of time to make sure their story is straight and aligns, before they go into court.
Good. Kira?
I don't know, something is fishy about like you writing about it the first day it happens too, because to me that still seems like you're trying to develop like an alibi to be quickly be like, let me get this out, like I'm trying to like get my story out first.
Interesting. Julie, last thought?
Yeah, we were also just talking about, there's like some inconsistencies, it was a little confusing where they talk about how their men came to the green at 5 o'clock in the morning, but as soon as they got there, they're dispersing, like what's the point then of y'all meeting at 5 a.m.? Like, it just seemed like there was a lot of unanswered questions in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. This is the quality of discussion that I was able to have with my 7th graders. They got super passionate about who actually fired the first shot at the Battle of Lexington. And then if you turn to the exit ticket, they had a chance to write about it from their own, using evidence to decide who they think fired the first shot. Raise your hand if you think for sure the Americans fired the first shot. Raise your hand if you think for sure that the colonists fired the first shot. Or sorry, the British. I'm sorry. Thank you. Raise your hand if you have no idea. Yeah, and this whole point of this, it's the nature of history. This is why we love doing what we do. There's not really a true answer in this. It's very vague. But, that being said, the United States Postal Service did pick one side, and they put this on the stand.
What it says the United States Post.
Yep. Interesting. And that's really about it.
Another round of applause for Hannah. Thank you guys so much for engaging with that sample lesson. Again, this was to model the type of thinking that you should be pushing on your students. A couple people were asking about like the length of discussion that we're having at the tables. I would not recommend giving your kids that much time to discuss right off the bat. We as adults needed to engage in a lot of the discussion necessary for us to make our own meaning. But like as you begin teaching sourcing, you can scaffold it with shorter discussions and more teacher-facilitated discussions.
Just to like quickly point that out, that's a really good point. I had kids talk about what they see for a long time, because that was the first skill for them to like see all of the details, and then they could take that and make some inferences based on that. And so we had just turn-in talks, like one person would talk, then the other person would. And then they did document A. I actually modeled document A, and then they did document B with partners, and they had more specific questions that were comparing document B to the other sources. So I changed it a lot in order to teach it to adults and have more of like a table discussion based. But if you have questions about how to like do this with kids, let me know.